In 2015, I went down to visit Matt Black Systems in the southern part of the UK and had a great conversation with Andrew Holm and Julian Wilson. We spent quite a bit, it's been a whole morning actually, talking about the evolution of Matt Black Systems. 5 years later, we've got a massive lens on, a really amplified lens on self-managed organizations and what they are, what they aren't, a lot of discussion and dialogue around that. So I'm delighted today on the Insight to Action and Inspirational Insights podcast program to have Andrew Holm. The book is just out. It's 500%. And we are looking to explore more deeply what happened inside Matt Black Systems. What was that evolution about? Because there's a lot of companies today who are dying and don't actually need to. It's optional. Survival is always optional in that sense, as I think was Edwards Demling once said. So Andrew, welcome to the program.
Hi, Donna. Yeah, nice to be back. My second
yes,
podcast.
That is true. We did one back in that period.
It was a while back.
It was.
But I'm a better man now than I was then.
Well, I know you're definitely more prolific. We now have the word out, in print. So that's book pretty 2. Exciting. Pardon me?
The second book.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's true. So let's get into this because we've got organizations who have let's fix the holes in our existing hierarchical system. What did you learn about that kind of an approach inside Matt Black? First of all, better tell us what Matt Black is about, because you're better equipped to do that than I am. And maybe just give a summary of the arc of the journey of the company.
Yeah, okay. So very, very potted sort of history of it. I joined the company in about 2003. It was it's a small company. There's 30 people in it, and it had difficulties. It was having a challenge, and its challenge was seen in what I call the contract properties of quality, delivery, price, and control. So they were all shining orange or red, and the customers were telling us that as well. So I was brought into the company by one of the founder's son, who wanted some assistance. And it was a traditional company. I think most people would recognize it as hierarchical and functional, albeit it was small. I came from a multinational background. It represented much the same structure as a multinational, but on a smaller scale. As a sort of potted history, we did what everybody else does. And that was we applied patches to the existing model in terms of tools like Lean and Agile, whether it be Lean as Cells or Agile and Scrum. Essentially, they're much the same things. And we applied many of the tools from these toolkits. And we got to a point, and I call it the page 37 moment. And page 37 is the page in the new book, 500%. And at that moment, we realized that all these patches had to be supported in an ongoing basis. And if you didn't support them, the behaviors went back to the sweet spot of that model. And we ran it for long enough to know that the behaviors were all drifting back. The page 37 moment was, it's a rethink, guys, because we ran out of cash. We'd spent a lot of money. £250,000 is not so much to a lot of organizations, but to a small organization, it was a lot of money, essentially with 2 shareholders as well. And that money had been spent, and it had failed to deliver any sustainable and meaningful improvements in terms of results that the customers could see and the shareholders could see and the suppliers could see and the employees could see. We then went on this journey to try and identify what the new world had to look like. And it wasn't something we sat down and designed on a fancy bit of paper and just implemented. It really was a journey of 1,000 mistakes and 1,000 lessons on how to do it, and sadly how not to do it. But in fact, we wangled through very nicely, and we got to a very different space. And that space we got to was based on a non-bureaucratic model. It wasn't hierarchical, it wasn't functional. It was like a network of people working together with contracts. So they were transacting through a kind of free market contractual relationship within the business. as well as outside. In fact, the inside mimic the outside. So that's the kind of arc of the journey. But I want to just go back to the starting place, if I may, Donna. And that is that we're all tempted to patch an existing model because it's a framework which we're very familiar with, both throughout our school and our university, and we're taught it at school, doing our MBAs and all these things. It reinforces that it's the one size fits all, the reductionist sort of deterministic model which we apply. And I've never done a turnaround yet and where the first move has not been to patch an existing model. In fact, I'm working one at the moment, and despite telling me they weren't doing it, they were doing it, which makes really very interesting, just the power of the fact that it's so pervasive in our society that you patch what you've got. Because if you start to unwind what you've got, what you're left with, where does it leave you? It's like removing the crutch, the structure that holds the whole system together. So having failed, and the great thing we did was that when I joined the business, we put in place measures and metrics at each stage. So that if we made a change, we could measure the result. So we knew what we were doing. So we knew what worked and what didn't work. And by the way, lean did work. So it actually worked. But the problem with it is it didn't work when you removed the support for it. And then it drifted back again. So it didn't sustainably work, but it did work. And we get then and it also worked on a sort of local basis. So in other words, you put lean into manufacturing and it had a direct effect. But did it have an effect at the whole company level? So it did improve things in manufacturing. You did get a benefit. So how did that impact, for instance, accounts? How did that impact design? How did that impact other areas of the business? And the truth is it didn't. And therefore the promise of the benefits you got in, for instance, by implementing lean manufacturing weren't spread across the whole company. But the net effect is you didn't get the top line or the bottom line, as we call it, improvements. The page 37 moment was exactly the moment when you realize that you can't go on patching. And actually, the solution doesn't lie in that direction. And it takes quite a lot of introspection to, one, identify you have a model, and two, to identify that you're patching it, and three, to identify you failed. Most companies want to patch their existing model.
I love the way you frame it. It's almost like the powerlessness of the patch.
Yeah.
It's the most alluring place to go and the least effective.
Yes, sadly it is. And I can completely understand why most companies choose to do that. So Taiichi Ohno, in his book on lean, in the Toyota production system, identified 7 wastes. What he didn't nail was what I consider as the biggest waste, and that is bureaucratic waste. The waste of the bureaucracy, the cost of the number of people in the bureaucratic structures, which far outweighs any 5% saving you could make or 10% saving you could make in other parts of the business. It's huge.
So now people may laugh at that because if they listen to you, they say, look, it's a 30-person company. How can there be bureaucracy and how can there be bureaucratic costs?
Yeah.
Elaborate on that, if you will.
So, if you have let's take, for example, accounts. Accounts is a bureaucratic overhead. Yes, it needs done, and I get, we have to have the question is, how do you minimize it? How can you do it in a different way so you can achieve the outcome without having a separate department and function, bureaucratic function? HR is another one. Now, HR is a larger company thing, but small companies still have a huge amount of time dedicated towards the management and control of human resources, as was supervisory costs, costs of simple things, telling people what to do rather than them doing it. simple management, baseline, supervisory management, quality, all these elements were built into the structure, built into this sort of structure. You have people in little boxes. That person's a quality box. This person's in an accounts box. This person's in an HR box. This person's in a management or supervisory box. And so it goes on. But of course, there's no flexibility of labor. They're all on the little boxes. And you can essentially separate them out into those boxes that add value and those boxes that don't add value to the outcome that the customers pay for. There isn't any other money that's coming into the business other than through investors' capital or coming from customers. And if it's coming from customers, they're paying for products or services. And it's the people who are directly involved with product and services in sales, design, and manufacture that are the ones that count. Frankly, the rest aren't adding value.
So we're talking about value added. Anything that's not value added falls into the bucket called bureaucracy.
Go on. I think that's a good starting point. I'll treat you.
Okay, that sounds good. If we look at the arc of the journey and you look at the page 37 moment,
yeah,
was that foreseeable? Or was it one of those things where you slam against the wall, there's no money, and all of a sudden you realize, okay, patching's not the solution. We need to completely rethink it. In other words, can companies avoid the page 37 moment without crashing into walls? Or is that kind of part of the process of recognizing that patching doesn't work? Is it pretty much inevitable?
Well, first of all, I have to say they can avoid it. And secondly, I have to say they won't. Because they can avoid it by making some radical changes up front in terms of their organizational structure and in terms of how they employ people and multi-skilling and things like that, and integrating bureaucracy into the everyday work of the people who are adding the value. They won't do it because I haven't been on one change program where they haven't done it the other way. And that is putting in tools to patch existing problems like lack of leanness, lack of agility, which are an outcome of the old fundamental structure, which, by the way, wasn't meant to be designed to be lean and agile. It was meant to be designed to produce large quantities of standardized goods, with relatively cheap and compliant labor. That was the model. If you don't have these conditions, then you need a different model. Patching that model doesn't solve the problem. So you need something more. Will you go through the patching? I'm almost certain you will. Sadly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for
and there's
that.
Some learning.
Well, of course. Well, but that's the opportunity. Not all learn. Some run in run the opposite direction and don't actually engage in that. Matt Black Systems has come up with a really unique model, and it's been data driven. You've documented everything, so you could tinker with it, experiment, run an experiment, find out if it worked, watch the numbers, see what they tell you, and then change course accordingly. It sounds like when people talk about self-managed organizations, it sounds like it's very neat and tidy. I can just go and pull this governance model off the design shelf and stick it in, inside my company. I mean, Holacracy comes to mind as being one of those kinds of models that sits out there. And I'm sure there are others, but or anything else that anybody else has designed that can sort of cherry pick. It's not that simple. What did you learn from the mess? What emerged in the messy part, and what actually happened? What was the sequence of events?
So first of all, you fight mess with mess. That sounds a bit strange, doesn't it, to say that? You fight mess with mess. The world is messy. And unless your systems are capable of handling that mess, and if they're too rigid, they're not, then you're going to fail. So an element of the reality of that world is you're going to have to handle that mess with mess. And that flexibility is hugely important. When you design your models, your 2B, your dream, where you're going, it has to account for I think was it William Ross Ashby, I think was his name, or his law of requisite variety. The system that you design has to be able to withstand the perturbations that are applied to it. And if it can't, it will fail. It's like over-optimizing a system for certain conditions, yeah, works terrifically well when these conditions exist and collapses when they don't exist. So designing a business, you have to design it to be resilient and to be capable of handling the everyday things that happen, like components not arriving in time, like people being ill, like customers canceling orders, like a project that you hoped to land doesn't land. All these messy things are part of the landscape of business and part of the messiness and its lack of order. So businesses fundamentally has to cope with the lack of order, because you wake up in the morning, it isn't all ordered. It's just not like that. When you do your system design, you have to accept that. You have to accept that it ain't a perfect world. And it does look beautiful when you design a system and it's heavily optimized for certain conditions that exist at a time. And you say, oh, that'll be terrific. It doesn't take long for these conditions to change.
So I think the other aspect of it that I think I'd like to explore a bit is that messy zone that we talk about is also the place where individually or personally, you know, the face gets put against the mirror and you say, who do you want to become in the mess? You know, it's the skills that go with ambiguity and the skills that go with uncertainty, because it is not certain. It is territory that's new. It's unfamiliar. There's not necessarily a rule book. You have to kind of really be mindful about the kinds of decisions you're making and watch and observe what happens with each one, as opposed to just making them and then pretending that there's no consequence to it, which is what happens in a lot of organizations. So in terms of the personal journey that you witnessed in the 30 some odd employees, what happened? What surfaced? What showed up?
Probably the most interesting thing that showed up is that very few chose to be in that mess. When given the option to stay and fight the mess or leave, most left, because it wasn't their mess and it wasn't a mess they wanted to engage with. And we all have that choice. And I suppose that choice is the difference between self-leadership and self-management. Self-management is you get given the destination and you live in the journey mess. Whereas self-leadership is you choose the destination and the journey mess. And, if you want autonomy, mastery, and purpose, which I think was part of Dan Pink's thesis, I think you end up in a place where the individual has to choose to be there, choose to take on that mess. Otherwise, they quickly disengage. If it's not their choice, they quickly disengage from the effort and skills and talents they need to apply in order to get through the mess. Once they've chosen that that's the mess they want to play in, then honestly, things get relatively easy because they bring their 6 human talents to it: curiosity, their imagination, their creativity, their realization skills, their cooperation skills. And they once they bring these skills, they fight the mess with a mess, and the battle is won. It's the failure to bring these skills in, sort of what I call a disease of the 20th century, which is disengagement. And that disengagement is so much to do with the traditional organizational model, which bizarrely looks so ordered and yet fails to handle the mess in its orderings. And you can quite see why it doesn't fit today. Doesn't quite see why it doesn't fit into the knowledge economy and many other economies as they transition from a kind of post-industrialization, which is, very fixed and standardized. In fact, the book has a very interesting story about an area which I do something about in shipbuilding, because I started my career off in shipbuilding as a design engineer. And I think it's an interesting story because it really nails how the shipbuilding, with its traditional hierarchical, functional, and heavily demarked model, very heavily demarked model, demarcation, failed to live with the mess, failed to achieve its potential, and collapsed. It didn't take long. Its collapse was in 10, 20 years, like a huge industry which employed vast tranches of people, which I think it was 20% of global shipping was produced in the Clyde. And that turned to nothing, almost nothing, in a relatively short period of time as the model collapsed. Now, people think it was an argument between workers and their management. That was a function of the model and wasn't a function of the battle between the people. The model was driving the behaviors. The bureaucracy simply was overwhelming, and eventually it collapsed.
When we talk about self-leadership, then, what are the core characteristics that you would wrap around that term?
First of all, it's the individual has to choose, and that's essential. They're choosing the mess they want to get into. Now, that's very rare. In most businesses, they don't choose. They're actually given a mess, and they have to then make the best of it. Now, in Matt Black Systems, the move that we made was they had to choose. That we didn't constrain them to what the business did at that time. If they wanted to start a company off to sell fishing rods, they could do that. It was their choice. Equally, if they chose to remain servicing the remaining market that was there, or the existing market that was there, that was their choice. So then, once it was their choice, self-management then follows on for that, because whereas self-management is to journey, self-leadership is to outcome. So they would automatically bring their self-management. And I think that's why self-management has a hole in it at the moment, because self-management doesn't encompass the most important part of it, which is the choice to do, the free will, unencumbered choice to choose what you do.
I know there's a company in the Basque area of Spain that makes choice the actual foundation, but other than that, you don't see it.
No, so the choice is essential. But choice, not process choice, but outcome choice. So people say, "Oh, we've got choice," but the choice is at process level. You can choose what activities you're doing, but not choose the destination. Mm-hmm. So it's about, you're here to make cakes. Yes, well, you can make the cake the way you like it. And I say, yeah, but what happens if they don't want to make cakes? Well, they have to make cakes because that's what we do. They wouldn't have joined us otherwise.
Yeah.
And I go, yeah, I think they joined you for a job, actually, because it was an economic imperative. I'm not sure they joined you because they love this kind of cake you're making.
One of the things that you did extremely well, when I look at all the interviews I've had with companies all over and conversations I've had, I'm a big fan of oversight. I'm a big fan of stepping back, seeing how things are unfolding, working with both data as well as intuition to sort of gauge what's going on here. Because in the realm of uncertainty is the zone that says, where do you have to have enough certainty that you've got a foundation for exploring, that confidence for stepping into the uncertain zone. So whether you call it psychological safety or whatever it happens to be, oversight is key. And you did that extremely well by stepping back multiple times and saying, let's try this, let's step back and take a look at it. What's the compass that you use to decide, okay, we're going in the right direction or we're going in the wrong direction? Because that right-wrong value judgment can be tricky sometimes. It could be right and wrong direction simultaneously. It looks right, but it feels wrong. Or it could be, there's a number of nuances to that. So talk about that a bit, please. What did you use as a compass?
Okay, I'm just got a little bit of a story here, a little bit of an arc of narrative. So data is to past, as intuition is to future. You don't have data about the future. Okay, you can make anything up in your head. You can do what you like. You don't have data about the future. Everything in the future has a probability associated with it. And human beings are really great at it. And the more they exercise their intuition, the better they get. But intuition is not a childish thing. Intuition is taking all the what-if statements of the data you've got and then analyzing it in a future perspective and coming out with what is your best judgment. So for me, it's about a little bit of a design process. You start off with the problem definition. You then say, well, what are all the options that are available to solve this problem? And then you go, what is, of this list of possible solutions, which is your preferred one? Now, the great thing is there isn't a preferred one in the sense that you don't know if it's going to work. But it's one that you are going to apply first and monitor the results from. So intuitively, we do this very well. And so fundamental to the future and to business design has to build in human intuition. It is absolutely essential. And I will argue black and white against anybody who tells me it's not, because then I'll ask them a simple question. What do you base your future on? And they will say the past. And I will say that is extremely dangerous. The weather tomorrow is going to be based on, the weather of yesterday. Oh, really? Because that doesn't have very much from where I'm sitting in the middle of the UK. So we do intuit it, and our brains are designed to intuit it. And I think if you trust your intuition, you get a long way and you get better if you exercise the muscle. But the intuition is based on data. Past data, yes, for sure. Yeah. And future imagination, for sure, and curiosity. So the more you read, the more you dig, the more curious you are, you can then bring your imagination to bear upon it to solve the problem. The reason why future data is important is that you're looking for obvious hockey sticks, what I call the hockey sticks of improvement, which is there's a ... generally improving, and then suddenly your intuition takes you to, it's going to be here, it's going to be massive, it's a straight line in a vertical direction upwards, and you're going, that's not how natural systems work. It just doesn't work like that, natural systems. They tend to be exponential. Huge amounts of hard work to go in at the start, producing a few results, slowly, they improve. So I don't know if that characterizes it well enough.
Well, it does a beautiful job of reframing, the role of data in the decision making. And I know just based on the process that Gary Klein mapped out in naturalistic decision making in terms of how your intuition uses data, it fits perfectly because it's working off of a database that sort of filters through what's going to work, what's not. And I think there's also, it's that blend between that bank of experience, but also that capacity to keep clear in one's mind. This is the mindset part of it, to keep clear in one's mind and be able to sense what's ahead, the foresight aspect of it, which you can't do when you're busy mentally wrestling down all sorts of things. It's work that's best done gardening or when you're not thinking about it, when you're intentionally taking your mind off it. So
I think also it's important. I mean, so I started from very much a kind of business design perspective because that was my background, but Julian started from a kind of humanities perspective. And I think it was that combination that was really quite an important combination, as it turned out, because I actually had to design a model for a human being before I designed the model. Well, it was not before, it was together. So what does your model of a human being look like, Andrew? And to start with, it looked like a stick man. You know what I mean? It was just rubbish. But over time, I developed, as my business models or my organization models, I like to call them, because it's not just business, it's just any organization. As we develop better models, I was developing a better human model, and also in parallel with that, better organizational models that fit human beings. And I eventually came up with my own model, which is, I looked at a number of models, but I found that the existential model was the one that I liked the best. And I changed it and made it my own. and basically motion away from the 4 fundamental anxieties, motion towards the 4 fundamental desires, as I called it, and then at least had something which I could then understand what motivated human beings and why purpose was so important and why relationships were so important and why being isolated was a negative thing and how we had to handle, that isolation anxiety, how people required structure, freedom brought anxiety. And therefore, once you kind of got the basics right, you say, okay, well, I do need to have some structure. I do need to include a purpose. So it all became a bit like a journey, a journey with a group of friends. And you begin to understand, because you've got a psychological model, how it all plugs together and how then that links to your design of organizational model. And that's, I think, an important part that I think is missing in a lot of organizational design. They haven't got a model for a human to start with.
Not grounded in that, which is critical.
Yeah.
Andrew, companies during this COVID pandemic have had some interesting reactions with the remote working. Some of them have decided to go for the time clock. So if you report when you go to the bathroom, it's a 9 to 5 thing, and if you're not putting in your hours, then you're not productive. That's a rather unfortunate assumption, I believe. Let's talk a bit about, if we can, where is the value being held, and how do companies turn that into practical? We this great time of reinventing it. What's the opportunity here for that?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things on that one. So yes, companies, I think, even measure the clicks on people's computers in order to work out whether they're at their desk or not. That is the extent of the complete madness that we have managed to bring into our world. Clicks per minute is now something that companies measure to make sure that people are actually by their computers. But this is what I call the time-based culture, where actually a company pays for an employee's time, and it's up to the company to use that time efficiently and effectively. That's how the traditional model looks at people. They're a mechanism, they're a cog in a wheel, and you need the cog in the wheel sitting at the desk and clicking in order for the system to work. Of course, the reality of it is that that's nonsense, because people aren't cogs in wheels, and people have to bring their curiosity, imagination, creativity, cooperation, and all these uniquely human skills in order to extract value from them. We're either going in a direction which is so extreme in the measurement of hours, or companies are rethinking or starting to think about, actually, how do you measure value? How is that done? Because hours are not important. And also, more importantly, they rob people of their productivity. So if I bring a new idea, I'm clever, I do things different ways. If I bring that to my work, I don't benefit at all, because I've still got to sit there for 8 hours clicking my mouse. Yeah, I mean, I have a smart way of doing it, of course. I get a machine to do it, keep the company happy, but there we are. But that's the way we've got to say, how do we encourage people to bring their creativity, their imagination, their cooperation to work? And that requires a different system of measurement. That system of measurement is not time, because a person can sit there for 8 hours, get paid for 8 hours, and do nothing and contribute nothing. But value is a very different measure. Value is when a person contributes to the overall organization and is measured the same way as the organization. First thing you can do is say, well, that's complicated, Andrew. And I say it is. It's much more complicated than the hours-based system, because all you have to do in the hours-based system is get people to clock in and clock out. But then it's your problem to work out what they're doing in between the clocking in and clocking out times. So meantime, in the other system, you use contracts, because that's the tool to generate a system of value, internal and external contracts. Now, when we did this at Matt Black Systems, we didn't know the importance of contracts. These internal agreements, in which there's 2 parties involved, and a swap of resources. So swapping an outcome which has been produced for money, for a or a consideration, started to value what people did. Even if it was really rough at the very start and messy, that didn't much matter, because it soon balanced over time with the wider marketplace outside the business. And actually people's magic and time and whatever system was in place could get valued. The key was the shift from process to outcome. So process is to time as outcome is to contract, because the outcome is what satisfies the contract. And frankly, nobody's interested in the time. When you go to a shop and buy a cake, you don't care, one, all the ingredients that went into it, the processes went into it. You don't care about any of the time went into it. You just care about the price on the cake and the cake. And that's the thing that's going to satisfy your contract for a cake. So that was the first step, let's say, of changing an hours-based culture. I call it a currency of hours to a currency of value. And the main tool, was the removal of the old tools, the clock on the wall, and the replacement of the new tools, the contract. I don't know if that kind of makes the point.
It absolutely does, and it's a layover with or a companion to what Doug Kirkpatrick talks about in terms of self-managed organizations in the Morningstar Institute. They have colleague letters of understanding, clues they're called.
Yeah,
but that's exactly what they do. They outline what's my commitment to you. So the word accountability gets replaced by the word commitment. I'm making a commitment to you, and if I can't meet my commitments, it's my responsibility to communicate that and explain why. It's a very different thing around, accountability being power, reporting to power versus reporting to, more peer-to-peer relationship.
The challenge with a clue, of course, is that there's no flow of value with it. Whereas what we wanted to do is we wanted to ensure there was a flow of value back. So I supply you a cake, you supply me with money, and the money values the cake, because you cannot calculate value add without the transfer of value, without the assessment of value. So a clue didn't work for us.
Right.
What worked for us was only the contract, and the contract only worked if it was a two-way transfer of resources. The cake out, the money in. The money valued the cake. Yeah. So there is quite a gap in terms of the approach.
So if we go back to the concept of people not getting paid for the value they bring inside organizations, how do you define value in that context?
First of all, you have to define value. And I think that's a really important part of it. So in other words, if you're a one-man band or an electrician or a plumber or any one-man band, you get at the end of the month to value yourself. And it's quite easy, because you look at the invoices you sent out and you subtract from that all the invoices you received or the bills you received. And you then, in your black box, your little kitchen or whatever it is, your black box, can work out how much value you added between the resources that you purchased and the resources you sold. So the question was, how do you bring that concept inside? So we've talked about that earlier, through contracts. Then when you actually know what value somebody's adding, then how do you share it out? Because it's not all about them. There's other people in the business that are also contributing. So the key is, obviously they've got to be paid for their contribution, but also there's a lot of IPR that's involved, which not necessarily is theirs, which they must pay royalties for and licenses for. So when they do eventually make that profit, that profit isn't just taken home in a pot. That profit has to be shared out, and we call it the 520s. And if you're clever, you work that out and you get 100. The 520s. So the 520s were 20% goes to the employee to take home in their pocket. 20% goes to the investment pot for, in effect, the employee, but for their virtual company, because we work on a cell-based system with each person in a cell. We call that a virtual company. Then you have 20%, which goes to the group of virtual companies that make up the whole company. Another 20% goes to the investors because they demand a return, which is entirely reasonable because they're risking their capital. And sadly, 20% goes to the taxman. So why is that important? It's important because it changes the social contract. Because 60% of the profit that's generated goes to the employees in some sense under their control. 20% goes to the investors and 20% goes to the taxman. I can't really do very much about that. So it's entirely transparent. The employee gets a basic salary. We have to pay that because we are forced to pay that as an entitlement because of the statutory minimum wage that exists within our jurisdictions, whether that be a Canadian, American, a British, or a European jurisdiction. We've got to pay that. We also pay another multiple of that based on a person's, what we call an employment disposition. And that's whether they are a pre-follower, a follower, a changer, a creator of models. And we found that to be a simple and effective way of building in somebody's talents and skills and making it generally align with, let's say, a talent set and rewarding curiosity, so that there was a benefit to people who were creative, imaginative, and curious. Otherwise, people, if they weren't rewarded for it, didn't bring that to work. So it was important that they were rewarded for it because it was the behaviors we were looking for. So you can see that the actual model for rewarding system, one wasn't based on time anymore because we didn't care about time. If they spent an hour at work and achieved all the goals, then brilliant, they're fantastic. And they spent 50 hours at work. As long as they didn't breach the European Working Hours Directive, then I wouldn't worry. That's their choice. It's very much their choice. But changing that to this value-based model, the currency of value, allowed us then to change the social contract and reward people who were adding the value more. I'm of the opinion also that the investors also add value by risking their capital. So, many would say, oh, that's not right. The investors are getting 20%. And I say they deserve 20% because there is capital being put at risk, and that capital cannot be mispriced. And it's got to be a fair return. So the key is transparency. There's nothing else. There's nothing hidden. There's not an assessment done, a magic assessment done by a manager. You simply work through the process. It's very well explained and documented. And if you want an increase in your salary, it's very clear what you've got to do. It's under your control, totally.
What it does is it brings it into one central focus to yourself, the autonomy, mastery, and it's all wrapped into one simple framework, and that's you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's not a complicated framework. It's a simple framework. It's a framework that probably most people would understand. It applies to the company as a whole, so nothing new. Just bringing that down to individual level and making it transparent. Yeah.
And I think the other thing you've described in that is also the shift between competition within to collaboration toward a larger goal, which is by far the more inspirational approach, far more engaging than coming up with a way to compete and so forth, which really actually is it's almost like a way to minimize talent and because you're constantly eroding creative juices that way.
It's a very interesting point you make there, because part of the accusations of our approach was that it would encourage selfishness, and that each person would act in their own selfish best interest. Of course, the bizarre paradox in that is they did exactly that. They acted in their own selfish best interest. But that was to be unselfish. So bizarrely, it was much better for them as individuals to join together in groups and attract work and contracts which you couldn't do as an individual. And therefore, cooperation became the key skill. But it wasn't until we split the organization up into single units to address this selfishness that we got this unselfish behavior. Quite extraordinary and paradoxical.
And beautiful to watch in terms of oversight, overseeing a dynamic and just watching it emerge and finding, oh my gosh, couldn't have planned that.
No, but that's right. And of course, it was the irony is it was the opposite of what everybody told us. And honestly, it was the opposite of what we believed.
Which is even better.
It is, yeah. I say, well, I'll be selfish, so I'll fight amongst each other. And you go, no, that didn't happen.
I think that goes back to something Umberto Maturana said, is that, people will cooperate. That is their true nature. It's not,
Going back to the model which we talked about earlier in the podcast about the existential model, that is built into the existential model through, the isolation and cooperation element of it. Both are ends of the same continuum, and we're driven to cooperate. We're not driven to be isolationist. And if you just rely and say, well, it's just natural behavior, it's driven naturally, and you soon get to relax about it and go, yeah, but it's going to happen anyway. And in fact, in many ways, in traditional organizations, a question why you need team building events. Why do you need team building events when people's natural propensity is to form teams and to cooperate, and they're driven to do it by their anxiety and their motivation? Yeah.
Thank you. I love that. And here's why I love it, because I would get called as an outside consultant. You get called to do team building exercises. It's like, there's no way. I'm not interested. What I am interested in is, what do you want to accomplish? Because it's going to take a team to do that. So whatever it is you want to accomplish, that, some sort of project you've got going on inside that requires a team effort and it's not happening, then that becomes the focus. And the effect is team, to strengthen team. But that's not the point and purpose.
No.
The point and the purpose is to get something done. And it's fascinating how many companies still think in those kind of terms, where you're coming in, and if you focus on team building, it's going to change how this particular project is running, when in fact there's other variables involved in why this project is or is not performing the way it could.
But if you haven't got teams being formed, successful teams being formed, the question you have to ask is, why not?
Yeah. What
is it in our structure and our dynamics which is breaking these essentially human, human skills, human natures, I can't think of a better word, of forming and cooperating in teams? So there's something disrupting that. Because if you put bring human beings together, in 1 week, they'll all be cooperating. Maybe the odd one won't be, but on the whole, they will be, to a common goal. So what is it in our businesses? And I think it's all about, it's all about reductionism. It's all about process, breaking the process down, putting people in separate boxes and distracting them from the outcome.
And quite frequently rewarding their individualism over rewarding a collective effort, actually getting things done, at that level.
But I think what we found is the most important part was, first of all, rewarding the individual. So you can't have a team without individuals.
Yeah.
They said there's no I in team, they tell me. Well, that's complete nonsense. there definitely is an I in a team. Yeah, the fact is that I is so important, and the team is an emergent property. You cannot touch a team. A team is something which is made out of individuals, and each individual on that team is hugely important. In fact, you can have the best individuals in a team and yet the worst team, and the worst individuals in a team and yet the best team, because the team performance is an emergent property.
Real Madrid proved that, it's a perfect illustration of that, because they had the best players in the world for Real Madrid, and it took them quite a while to reach that emergent level, because it was the perfect storm of egos on top of that. So
that's right, and you don't know. I mean, and only the best managers have got this concept of that emergence, that different level, and actually building a team, constructing the team, not necessarily of the best players.
Yeah.
Sometimes of a real mismatch.
And yet it works.
Yeah.
And
this is the wonderful thing about being human, isn't
it? It is, absolutely.
It is the most pivotal part of change, and that is the contract. If you don't have the contract, and that transfer of value both ways, you can't change your organization. You can't be a self-leading organization. You can be a self-managing organization. So a self-managing organization essentially, as you know, is about process and not outcome. Self-leading is about outcome and process follows. And it's that which is the huge difference. So do you capture your contracts? And they say, oh, yeah, we capture orders. Orders, not contracts. And do you capture your contracts internally? Oh, we've got clues. And I think, well, that's a start. Well done. But it doesn't allow you to make the shift. It just keeps you where you are in the traditional paradigm. It's only when you move the other way, to the scary land, that actually you'll get real change. So I think that's an interesting point we've just got to crystallize out.
One of the things businesses tended to do is separate itself from the rest of the world, either that or try and run it. So there's two aspects of it. And we've got in the world today a lot of political governance models that are being put to the test and may we say epically failing in some instances. So what's the connection between rethinking a business or reinventing completely a business model and looking at, stretching out to the governance level of a nation?
Yeah. Okay.
Small question.
That's solving world peace.
Why not? We're here.
Why not? That's it. So what I think is important is to look at the fundamental patterns involved. So what are the patterns at each level? Are there common patterns? Are we trying to reinvent the wheel, or actually is it just a different size wheel at different levels? And when you look at nature and use the example of a fern is actually built up of ferns, little ferns, which are built up of more little ferns. In fact, they're called fronds. The whole fern is a fractal. It's a fractal pattern. It's an extremely efficient way of building larger things from smaller things. Nature uses them a lot in snowdrops and many other things, including plants and animals. They form the building blocks of natural systems. And why do they do that? Because it's very energy efficient to do it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can take a bunch of stuff which is common and familiar at one level and apply it in scale to the next level up. So then we don't have to create a whole new language and at whether it be a regional or global level, it's not a new language. It's the same language as we're familiar with at the bottom.
A couple more questions. 500%. What does that refer to? Why did you call your book that?
Okay, so yeah, it's a very good point. So that was the productivity that increased. We got a 500% increase in productivity by deploying our new model. In fact, it's more than that now. But we got a 500%.
And that was in year over year?
It was over a period of, let's say, it's very difficult to put your thumb on it.
Yeah.
Because we were sort of wandering around the dark because we didn't know where we were going. Yes, it took us. Certainly from where we started to where we ended up, we got a 500% improvement in productivity. No, we didn't go for that. We just went for, if we got 20%, we were going to win. You get 500%. It was like, well, that's madness. It just shouldn't be, it shouldn't be possible, Donna. It really shouldn't be possible. And it was astonishing.
So what I love about that is that, first of all, if you aimed for 500%, you would get it at a higher cost. It would be an expensive venture. But when you don't, this is where there's a lot of confusion, which is another program, but there's a lot of confusion around being, sort of looking at outcome and being attached to achieving a fixed outcome versus having a goal, or sort of, some people don't like the word goal, but aiming for something that works efficiently on multiple levels and getting that kind of outcome is a sweet deal.
It is a sweet deal, and especially as it was a dream. It's a fantasy. It was nothing more. How could? What we found it was achievable and very achievable, which says a lot about then why aren't we exploring more models? Why aren't we exploring? Because given that we've proven that it is doable, why do people stick with the old model? What, you're not interested in 500% improvement productivity? That's incredible. You're not interested in saving your industry? I don't understand. Why not? But it's the power of the current model and its bureaucratic nature. People in charge tend to be the bureaucrats. And it's not in their best interest, if I'm brutally honest. Not because they're bad people. I don't want to say that at all. They're not. No. It's just not in their interest to see the model develop in the direction that Matt Black's systems has taken. Because we don't have a bureaucracy. We don't have any management. We don't have, people do their own accounts. They're responsible for their accounts. We don't have this cabal of people who are in supervisory and roles oversight. It's a network.
Let's just go back to what you talked about at the beginning to close off, and that is that you talked about HR, you talked about some of the, financial. That is now embodied in, as I understand it, software. It's
embodied in software, but it's more important than that. It's embodied in the humans. So the software is just a tool. Yes, it's important, but it's not that important. What is important is that it's embedded in the individuals. So if there's an HR issue, then it's the people who make the products and design the products and who actually do it all. They're the ones that solve that problem. If there's an accounting problem, each person in our business does their own accounts every month. They're fabulously competent at stripping a P&L account and balance sheet. They know exactly what's going on. You're not going to pull the wool over their eyes. So the IT systems gives them some structure, but it's not the most important part of it.
Any advice you'd give to a business owner whose company is not yet hit the wall, but the wall is in sight, and they're contemplating doing things differently, which is like almost a requirement these days. But what advice would you give them?
Be bold. The chances of them actually being bold, I understand the anxiety that comes with company management and company ownership. It's a huge amount of anxiety, and it's often a lot of people who are involved in that space as consultants don't quite understand what that weight of responsibility looks like and feels like when you wake up in the middle of the night, almost screaming because you've got to pay the wage bill for the month, or you're running out of cash, or there's a product that's gone through failure and failed test, and it's very, very challenging. But two things is you fight mess with mess, and you be bold. And don't be over controlling. And the problem is that a lot of managers and a lot of behaviors are reinforced by our universities and schools, and it's all about control, and it's all about central control, and it's all about leadership. And I say it's not about leadership. It's about self-leadership. It's about encouraging each individual to lead themselves and to manage themselves. So bizarrely, the paradox of leadership is to destroy leadership. If you want to be a great leader, then distribute leadership.
Ah, beautiful. This is where the starfish comes in.
It's one of the hardest things to do, Donna, is that, when you have a network organization, there becomes an emergent property, like its strategy isn't a strategy which is developed from the top. It's an emergence from the bottom. It's an emergent property. It's so tempting to step in and sort of own it and kind of shoulder it and tinker with it. And it's the last thing you can ever do because it's such a precious thing. It's like a it's like a beautiful thing you've got, and yet you can't touch it. It's difficult to explain. It's like a Mexican wave in a huge stadium. You know, can you explain the Mexican wave in a person? You can't. You haven't got the language to explain what a Mexican wave looks like at an individual level. And yet, clearly in front of your eyes is this emergent property, which is this Mexican wave that's circling round. And it's that which you have to be brave enough not to tinker with and just to leave. Even although you see it going wrong at the emergent level, it might not be at the local level. So what you see as an emergent property is not necessarily a function of what's functional behavior, which is underpinning it. So be careful.
All right, there you go. That's food for the future, as it were. Yes. Andrew, the book of it is available in what format? The usual, Amazon.
Kindle, it's on Amazon. It's in Kindle format. You have to type in 500% how two pioneers transform productivity. I think it's a story. It's an interesting story. I think it will help people who are interested in business as a whole and organizational design, getting the best out of people. And I think it brings some nice language and distinctions to it all. How which measures we use, how we use them, as well as what I call the famous page 37 moment. You hit and you realize it's not working.
Yeah, and I think what I appreciated about myself, reading the book myself, is that it walks you into the mess. So much for the delusion of it being all nice and tidy. It walks you straight into the mess, and that allows you to kind of see what are the underlying principles that start to emerge through it. So that's a real experience in emergent stuff. As you read it, you can sort of see how things are showing up, and fortunately, you're able to identify them not just through data, but also because you have your intuitive instincts working as well. Yeah. Right. Andrew, thanks very much for being on the program. Delighted to have you here again. I'll also put the link for the previous conversation we had quite a number of years back, available for people to take a look at. So
great, Donna. Well, thank you very much. I hope people do something about it, because I think it's time in our world now. We've got to make this move. It's apposite. The time is apposite.
I'm Donna Jones. I provide personal growth for business, mentoring leaders and decision makers who are really ready to adapt their awareness and inner skill set to both meet and match the complexity and speed of change. I also bring intuitive insight into decision making and leadership expansion so that collaboration can benefit from conflicting perspectives and higher trust. By embedding a healthy balance between certainty and uncertainty, growth at a personal and organizational level has a serious chance. Contact me through LinkedIn or through www.FromInsightToAction.com. And it's Donna, Dawna.